It took Montana 30 years to remove one dam from the Clark Fork, 30 years of toxic sediment, federal orders, and bureaucratic war. Then, in 2024, 4 dams came off the Klamath. More than 10,000 Chinooks surged past former dam sites. For the first time in a century, fall-run salmon were detected in Oregon. To understand what that return means, you need to know why those dams were built. Throughout the early and mid-20th century, the United States embarked on an era defined by hydroelectric expansion. Dams rose rapidly across western rivers, each designed as an instrument of modernization. Hydropower promised cheap, reliable electricity for cities, mines, and factories, fueling economic growth in regions once considered remote. The Columbia, Snake, Sacramento, and Klamath rivers were transformed into engineered corridors, their flows regulated by concrete, their valleys flooded to form reservoirs. Federal agencies such as the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation led the charge, backed by New Deal funding and later by public-private partnerships. Local utilities and private companies, including Pacific Power and Light and Montana Power, joined the push, securing licenses and power contracts that locked in river control for generations. This approach treated rivers as resources to be optimized, not as living systems. Dams like Milltown on Montana's Clark Fork and Iron Gate on the Klamath were built to serve industry and settlement, with little regard for ecological continuity. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Salmon and steelhead migrations were blocked, spawning gravels buried, and water temperatures altered. By the 1970s, more than 40 salmonid populations in the Columbia Basin faced extinction, and tribal fisheries across the Northwest were in crisis. For the Klamath and Clark Fork, the logic of economic progress left a legacy of lost habitat, declining fish runs, and deepening conflict over who gets to define the value of a river. Noah. Fisheries would later call dam removal the centerpiece action for recovery, but in this era, engineering and utility trumped ecology. When a dam interrupts a river, the damage ripples outward in ways that reach far beyond lost electricity or altered scenery. For salmon and steelhead, the consequences are immediate and measurable. Anadromous fish, which migrate from the ocean to spawn in the upper reaches of rivers, find their ancient roots severed. Structures like Milltown Dam on the Clark Fork and the Iron Gate on the Klamath blocked access to hundreds of miles of historic habitat for nearly a century. Spawning gravels vanished beneath stagnant reservoirs, and the water behind these barriers warmed and slowed, compounding the stress on cold water species. Sediment, once flushed downstream each spring, accumulated in thick, contaminated layers, further degrading water quality and suffocating eggs in the gravel. The biological collapse triggered a cultural crisis for the tribal communities that had depended on these fish for food, ceremony, and identity. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, for example, hold treaty rights to fish the Clark Fork. Yet with salmon and steelhead unable to reach their spawning grounds, traditional harvests dwindled to nothing. Subsistence fishing, once a seasonal anchor, was replaced by federal food aid. Ceremonial practices that relied on the return of salmon became impossible to sustain. Generations grew up without first-hand experience of the river as a living corridor, eroding language and knowledge tied to the cycles of fish and water. By the late 20th century, the river's altered state was no longer seen as a technical achievement, but as a biological emergency. Noah Fisheries would later describe dam removal as the centerpiece action for restoring salmon and steelhead runs across the Pacific Northwest. The stakes reach beyond symbolic restoration. Without access to their historic habitat, populations faced extinction, and tribal rights, guaranteed by treaty and federal law, remained unfulfilled. For many scientists and tribal leaders, removing the barriers was not just an ecological gamble, but the only credible path to recovery. The evidence from early dam removals, such as the Elwha and Penobscot, suggested that rivers could rebound, but the path forward was fraught with scientific and political uncertainty. The question became not whether the river could recover, but whether society was willing to give it the chance. Milltown Dam's story begins in 1908 when a timber crib hydroelectric dam rose at the confluence of the Clark Fork and Blackfoot rivers, built by copper baron William A. Clark. For decades, the dam's reservoir trapped more than 6 million cubic yards of sediment laced with arsenic, copper, and other heavy metals, waste that washed downstream from Butte, and Anaconda's mining legacy. The contamination seeped into groundwater, tainting drinking wells and rendering the river corridor a public health hazard. By the early 1980s, federal authorities designated the Clark Fork and its impoundment as a Superfund site. This legal status gave the Environmental Protection Agency extraordinary leverage, the power to demand not just cleanup, but removal of the dam itself. Tribal advocacy, led by Confederated Salish and Kootenai elders such as Tony Incashola Sr., kept the issue in the public eye, framing the dam's existence as a violation of treaty rights and an ongoing threat to cultural survival. The regulatory process dragged on for years. In 1998, a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensing hearing brought expert testimony about the dam's structural decay and the mounting risks from contaminated sediment. When Northwestern Energy acquired the dam in 2003, the transfer of ownership forced a reckoning over liability. The Environmental Protection Agency, acting on new authority, issued a formal order in 2004. The dam would be removed and more than 2 million cubic yards of toxic sediment excavated. Negotiations over funding and technical strategy stretched into 2007, involving state agencies, nonprofits, and tribal representatives. The physical breach came on March 28, 2008, when engineers opened a bypass channel and released 44 million gallons of water, beginning the process of draining the reservoir. By 2009, the dam's hydropower license was officially revoked, and habitat restoration began in earnest. Each milestone reflected a collision of engineering, law, and cultural persistence, a 30-year campaign shaped by federal statutes, tribal rights, and the science of river recovery. August 28, 2024, reset the course of river restoration in the American West. On that day, the last barrier in the lower Klamath system came out, completing the coordinated removal of 4 major dams. This single project reconnected about 400 miles of historic salmon habitat, corridors that had been blocked for generations. More than 2,200 acres of former lake bed, once buried under slack water, were exposed to daylight and river flow for the first time in a century. The physical transformation was immediate. The Klamath, once segmented and controlled, became a continuous, dynamic channel again. NOAA Fisheries, the federal agency charged with protecting anadromous fish, called dam removal the centerpiece action for salmon and steelhead recovery, not just for the Klamath, but as a model for other rivers in crisis. The scale and speed of this intervention set a new benchmark, shifting the debate from theoretical restoration to measurable, system-wide change. The first year after dam removal delivered a surge of empirical data that cut through decades of speculation. Over 10,000 adult Chinook salmon were recorded passing the site where the final barrier once stood, a migration event not seen in living memory. Fish moved upstream into channels and tributaries that had been blocked for more than 60 years, reclaiming habitat that agency biologists had long written off as lost. The return was not limited to passage alone. Field teams documented the first Chinook spawning above the former dam sites in more than 6 decades. In a striking data point, a fall-run Chinook was detected in Oregon, marking the first such observation in more than a century. These counts represent more than a symbolic victory. They offer direct evidence that physical reconnection of the river produced immediate biological value. The numbers also validate the NOAA fisheries position. Dam removal is not simply a gesture, but a measurable action capable of restoring salmon and steelhead runs at a scale that matters for both ecosystems and the tribal communities who depend on them. Sediment trapped behind the dams now moves downstream, introducing a layer of uncertainty to the early signs of recovery. Fisheries scientists caution that the release of accumulated silt can disrupt spawning beds and temporarily cloud the water, complicating efforts to measure true biological gains. Recovery for coho salmon is projected to take between 6 and 12 years, while Chinook populations may require 15 to 20 years to approach historical abundance. Accurately assessing the impact demands patience and rigor, at least 12 to 15 years of monitoring spanning multiple salmon generations before definitive conclusions can be drawn. Annual fish counts, red surveys, and genetic identification of run types form the backbone of this monitoring effort. Scientists also track sediment loads, water quality, and habitat conditions to capture the river's evolving state. Only by collecting this breadth of data can policymakers and tribal co-managers distinguish short-term fluctuations from genuine ecological recovery. Chinook salmon traveling up newly reconnected river corridors do more than restore a single species. Their return supplies a vital food source for the endangered southern resident orcas, whose survival depends on healthy runs of large Chinook. The future of these whales is now partly tied to whether salmon recovery can be sustained over decades, not just seasons. For tribal nations, the stakes are equally profound. A reliable salmon run means the revival of ceremonies, language, and food security, restoring practices that have been interrupted for generations. If the river's recovery holds, tribal communities will not only reclaim lost harvests, but also regain a foundation for cultural renewal. The question now extends beyond fish counts. Can a reopened river rebuild the entire food web, from stream bed insects to apex predators, and support the intergenerational rights of people who have waited a century for this chance? Dam removal is no longer just a theory. It is a test unfolding in real time, with Chinook surging upstream and coho recovery lagging behind. For tribal nations and endangered orcas, these outcomes carry existential weight. The next decade will reveal if policy can outpace uncertainty. Your perspective matters.